Welcome to our webinar, Multilingualism, the New Standard for Global Competence, which is MotherLanguage+2. Note here, the standard for global competence is no longer just one's own native language. I am Anne-Marie Carlson, leader of the Committee on Teaching About the United Nations, CTAUN, CTAUN for short. We at CTAUN are very pleased that you have joined us on this special day, which is President's Day here in the US, but is also International Mother Language Day. According to UNESCO, the idea to celebrate the International Mother Language Day was the initiative of Bangladesh and approved at the 1999 UNESCO General Conference. It is within its mandate for peace that it works to preserve the differences in cultures and languages that foster tolerance and respect for others. In the spirit of multilingualism, I'll welcome you in Norwegian. God dag. Since both my parents were born in Norway and most of my family lives there. So I learned Norwegian early on, a language with many similarities to Swedish and some to Danish. But also, since we lived and worked for close to 3 years in Indonesia, let me say Selamat Siang to you. Selamat Siang is good day in Bahasa Indonesia, Indonesia's national language, and also very much alike Bahasa Malaysia, spoken in Malaysia. Other languages have always fascinated me, and I did also study French, along with some Spanish, Latin, and Mandarin. But now back to all of us here at this webinar. It's great to note that we have 52 countries represented here today with our 311 registrants. You've already been given access to today's program, but I'd like to note that you can also find this on the main page of CTAUN's website, which is www.teachun.org. In terms of questions, do note that we'll be having an interactive session led by Ramu Damodaran, first chief of the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative, a member of CTAUN's Advisory Council, and now also a CTAUN member. Our chat box will be open throughout the webinar, and we intend to respond to most of those questions submitted then or later. On to the program. Mark Woodworth Harris has been the inspiration and major force behind today's webinar. Yes, he is a member of CTAUN's Advisory Council. We chose Mark to lead our planning, organize this webinar, and choose the best speakers. Why? With his being the President Emeritus of Berlitz and ELS Language Services, along with being the creator and co-founder of Many Languages, One World, coupled with his knowledge of so many languages, he was the very best choice. So Mark, please take over.
Good morning. Bonjour, buenos dias, das vidania, ni hao, salam alaikum. It's very nice to be with you here today, and we're looking forward to this opportunity to update you on the trends in multilingualism, as well as the very important mission of protecting and promoting mother languages. Next. Language is the DNA of culture. Our mother language dictates and defines how we experience our lives and how we understand our world around us. Each language we learn reveals new realities and truths we hitherto could not perceive. Today, let us be grateful for our mother language, which has enabled and empowered us to learn, understand, and remember our world. And let us always value, respect, and defend the mother languages of others. Next. Next. Peter. If, yes, could we go back, Peter? National policies of education are the primary drivers of the learning of languages. And in the more homogeneous countries or regions, we can see that education has been clearly legislated and there are policies shared amongst the people. The EU is exemplary and has a very clear guidance to the education ministries in all of the member states that the dominant language should be the medium of primary education. A second language, which would be either English, French, or German, which they call world languages, would be taught from first grade through the end of secondary school. And then a second foreign language would be taught from the first year of secondary for 5 years. And this would be another official language of the EU. India, a country that boasts 450 languages, has 4 official languages: Hindi, English, Punjabi, and Urdu. In each state, local state language is used for primary, and English as a second language is introduced from the 5th grade. But at the university level, all courses are taught in English. Next. Indonesia has established a policy whereby Bahasa Indonesia will be the only official language from amongst 700 languages which are spoken by the population of that country. English is introduced in the high school and is taught only 4 hours per week. China is a country where Mandarin has been asserted as the official language throughout the country, subsuming many dialects and many lesser spoken languages. English is introduced at the 3rd grade, and students learn English all the way through high school. And more importantly, 20% of the Gaokao, which is the uniform university entrance exam, is attributable to their score in English. So English is very important in China as a 3rd language. The other region that I've looked at is Sub-Saharan Africa, which has a younger population than any of the other parts of the world, where there are local languages. More than 2,000 languages are spoken in Sub-Saharan Africa, many of them unwritten languages. And those, there are national and post-colonial languages as well. There are also what are called cross-border African languages, such as Berber, Swahili, Hausa, Xhosa, Arabic, Yoruba, and Fulani. So the status quo in Sub-Saharan Africa is 1 or more indigenous languages, a national language, and if the national language is not a post-colonial language, then additionally 1 or more post-colonial languages. Next. So if we look at these primary and secondary schools in these regions and countries that I've just mentioned, we're accounted for 80% of the world's primary and secondary education. Unfortunately, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the out-of-school ratio is approximately 30%. So whereas the total number of students attending schools is estimated by UNESCO to be 1 billion students around the world, there are another 350 million students who are, quote, out of school. And these are the focus of UNESCO and the United Nations. Next. This is a picture, a graphic picture of what's going on in the European Union. And as you can see, many of the countries have 100% participation in the 2 foreign language approach of education. The average is more than 60% throughout the community, with some countries being, as you can see on the right, Portugal, Greece, much less likely to be teaching 3 languages than the other countries. Next. National education policies, unfortunately, can also be used to suppress language. Later we'll be talking to Mr. Agulo about his experience in Spain, where Catalan has been suppressed for more than 275 years. China, in an effort to unify the country, has elected to have Mandarin as the only official language, and it's gradually being introduced to the schools in all parts of the country and those countries which are part of China's union. Indonesia, as I mentioned before, has chosen one language to unite thousands of islands. Unfortunately, there are many cases where the suppression of language comes together with genocide or with the subjugation and expropriation of land. And this continues in many parts of the world. And the suppression can come to the extent of loss of life. In the 1880s, both in the United States and in Canada, as well as other countries, Native First Nation people and Native Americans were not allowed to learn their mother languages. They were taken to boarding schools. In the boarding school, if the student was caught speaking their native language, they were beaten. And it's a pity to know that many students never left those boarding schools. Next. There are many other drivers of language. We're all aware of climate change, and we're aware that climate refugees arrive in countries where they don't speak the language, as do other conflict refugees. There's increased diversity in all populations around the world, and there's more global travel. So these languages are being learned for all of those reasons, and particularly for international educational exchange and virtual study, which gets us in touch with languages and across borders. Next. Next. The internet is also impacting the use of language and the learning of language. People are learning online more than ever before. But at the same time, indigenous languages, which our next speaker will talk about, 43% of those indigenous languages out of the total number of languages currently spoken, which are 6,700, are not written. And because they're not written, they cannot be used easily in internet or in social media. Next. The UNESCO Courier recently published a very interesting article about the impact of social media and the internet on language learning. And I quote them: "The internet, which is now the primary way of sharing information, has a role to play in promoting multilingualism." Next. This is a picture of internet users by language. What you'll notice here is that the use of the internet is not proportional to the number of native speakers of a language or mother tongue speakers of the language, and that English, of course, as a mother tongue is not as impactful as the use of English language as a common medium of understanding. But this gives you a picture of what the internet users are by language. And if we move to the next slide, this is the distribution of knowledge through Wikipedia as an example of distribution of and sharing of knowledge over the internet. And what we can see on the left is that 6.2 million articles are submitted and present there in English. But curiously enough, Cebuano, which is one of the languages in the Philippines, one of the languages, accounts for 5.5 million articles. And this is an indication that a small number of speakers have actually contributed more information, and they felt that Wikipedia was the place to do that. If you look to the far right, we'll be talking about Català, and Català is figured in this graph as well, prepared by UNESCO. Next slide. And what we have seen is that there are many languages, but we have only one world. And I've chosen this picture because these are MLOW winners, and we'll be listening to 3 of those essayists who are multilingual. And here we also see Mr. Ramu Damodaran, who was the co-founder of this Many Languages, One World program that we'll be talking about later. So thank you very much. We will next hear from Aleksey Tsikarev, who has been serving as an expert in the year of the indigenous languages. He's a permanent member of the UN Commission on Indigenous Issues. And he's joined us today to talk to us about his lifelong mission in preserving and sustaining indigenous cultures and languages. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much for the Committee on the Teaching of about the United Nations for inviting me to this very important event on this important day, International Day of the Mother Language. I would like to greet you all in my own language, the Karelian. Terveh teile, hyvät rahvas, menestystä ja onnea teille. I just wished all of you a lot of success and a lot of luck in the coming year. So my language is the Karelian language, as I said, and it is spoken in the Republic of Karelia, in the Russian Federation. It's northeast part along the Russian-Finnish border. Karelian is one of the many indigenous languages of the Russian Federation and of the world, and it shares a lot of common challenges that indigenous people's languages face in the era of globalization and global problems such as climate change, the need to preserve biological diversity, linguistic diversity, and many other very serious challenges that the global community faces. It is important to say that the permanent forum on indigenous issues that I represent here as a member from Eastern Europe, Russian Federation, Central Asia, and Transcaucasia, played a role in proclamation of the International Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019, and consequently the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, the period that starts this year and ends in 2032. So the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed this period as the International Decade of Indigenous Languages to draw attention to the critical loss of indigenous languages and the urgent need to preserve, revitalize, and promote these languages, and to take urgent steps at the national and international levels. For that purpose, a task force was created under the leadership of UNESCO, and this task force is comprised of representatives of indigenous peoples and states. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that has a mandate to discuss the issues of socioeconomic development, culture, education, environment, health, and human rights, and coordinate indigenous issues within the United Nations family. At its 20th session last year, recommended that the International Decade provides a unique opportunity to ensure sustainable change in complex social dynamics in order to preserve, revitalize, and promote indigenous languages. The Permanent Forum also made a special accent on full and effective participation of indigenous peoples at all levels, and the involvement of all relevant government ministries, such as those for education, culture, and finance, in the design, planning, financing, and implementation of all activities of the International Decade. It is also important to say that the International Year of Indigenous Languages had a purpose to promote human rights-based approach when it comes to indigenous languages, and also pay the global community's attention to this very serious crisis of linguistic diversity. While the International Decade has a mission to transfer from raising awareness to concrete action. As I recently said, the International Year's achievement was to further develop, that will be further developed during the decade, is promotion of the human rights-based approach. As the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in its Article 13 says, indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. It is very important to understand the interlinkages between the linguistic rights of indigenous peoples and other human rights. There is a lot of research how linguistic well-being of communities has an impact on the health and mental health of indigenous communities. It is also, I should also say that you cannot preserve or speak about preservation and revitalization of indigenous languages without understanding languages linkages to the traditional way of life. It is noticeable in many research that the better you preserve and the better conditions are for preservation of traditional ways of life of indigenous peoples, their traditional occupations and crafts, the better you preserve indigenous languages in that environment. Also, I would like to emphasize the leading role of indigenous peoples in the International Decade. This most important issue of the leading role of indigenous peoples has emphasized the event, one of the first event to mark the United Nations Decade of Indigenous Languages that was held by the Cherokee community in the United States, in the state of Oklahoma, that was held in the very beginning of January with presence of indigenous leaders, language speakers, and language planners from all over the world, including the United States, Canada, Russia, New Zealand, and other places. Similar initiatives have been organized in other places of the world. In the Russian Federation, in my own country, a very important event to plan for action during the International Decade on the local and national level took place in the city of Murmansk in December last year. And today, on this important day of the International Mother Language Day, an outcome document of that important meeting was publicized. Before the International Decade was proclaimed by the General Assembly, UNESCO conducted a series of consultations in socio-cultural regions of indigenous peoples, and indigenous peoples had a chance to acknowledge their priorities and goals for the International Decade. Among these goals, I could list language planning that should happen towards each language separately, because each language has own priorities, each language community has own priorities, and each language has a different level of vitality and needs different measures. While some languages are spoken by just tens of people, they need to be revitalized, and the number of speakers of these languages should be increased. At the same time, there are languages that are spoken by thousands of peoples, and they're already at that level that need to be promoted on the internet, in the language technology, and the emphasis could be done on supporting of the literature and other forms of linguistic existence. One of the most important goals of the International Decade is to support language activists at that work on the grassroots level. It is important to mention that most of the work in linguistic communities, work on revitalization, promotion of indigenous languages, is actually on the shoulders of a small group of people that are called language activists. And sometimes these people work is based just on the enthusiasm with no financial support or limited financial support. And these people sometimes face the lack of understanding even within their own communities. And that's why in many events preceding the International Decade, experts have spoken about the need to have special programs to support linguistic activists all over the world. Another priority is the legislative reform and education system that is seen by many indigenous peoples as the primary means to support and transmit indigenous languages. At the same time, it is also important to understand that the educational system should be flexible, and they should also be acceptive of indigenous people's own experts and language masters, such as musicians, poets, and elders that speak these languages the best. So these people should be able to participate in the formal and informal educational systems. There should be also moves to make the educational systems closer to indigenous peoples. In Russian Federation, for example, we have such projects as mobile schools and nomadic schools that allow for the teachers to be closer to nomadic communities, for example, in the Russian Arctic, in the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia or Yamalo-Nenets autonomous region. And this is how the indigenous children can learn their languages without being taken from their traditional environment and traditional way of life. Another goal and important task is to overcome the digital divide, because the digital technology should be also part of the revitalization and maintenance package that would be provided during the International Decade. And one of my last points is the importance of indigenous languages for the modern democracy, for the peace and reconciliation, for governance of indigenous people's own traditional decision-making institutions and representative bodies, because without that, indigenous languages cannot actually expand to the many different domains where they should be spoken. This is, of course, one of the most important is family, the governance system, indigenous owned organizations, then also the media, education system, as was mentioned, and the digital sphere. One of the most important recommendations of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in this regard was for the national governments to establish national action plans that would comply with the global action plan, but also be grounded at the acceptive of the local circumstances and local specificities. And I'm happy to say that in my country, in the Russian Federation, among first in the world, a national action plan was recently, I think it was last week, was recently adopted by the federal government. And I think similar actions are happening on the national level. And lastly, I would like to say that the International Decade provides an opportunity for a change of paradigm, not only in indigenous peoples communities, where sometimes there is a lack of solidarity, a lack of understanding towards the revitalization, and this should be actually a decision made by the communities themselves in compliance with the right to self-determination, to revitalize or not to revitalize indigenous languages. This is this is the task and the main responsibility of the linguistic communities themselves. But these changes and understanding changes are happening not only in indigenous communities, but also in other actors. For example, there is an increased role of the private sector right now. The private sector can play a significant role, not only in financing of indigenous people's languages programs, but also in using them in their own operations, and recognition of recognizing indigenous languages by industrial companies in those territories where they operate. Having said that, I would like to invite you all to the many events that will be that will take place during the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, including the opening ceremony, official opening ceremony in the headquarters of UNESCO in Paris. There will be also an opening ceremony in the General Assembly, and around the session, the next session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that will start on April 25th this year. And of course, one of the most important topics of the upcoming session will be implementation of the Global Action Plan for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. I wish you all a very good, a happy International Mother Language Day, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aleksey. A very important cause, and one that you have been dedicated to as an advocate for many, many years. And thank you for sharing your time today. I know you're traveling. Then this next example is really the example of what can happen as a consequence of politics. Next slide, please. I've put together a timeline which you can read if you access this after the presentation. It will be posted on the CTAUN website. But basically, I'll say that during the 13th through the 15th century, Catalonia was extremely important in the entire Mediterranean area, and Català, the language of the Catalonian people, was spoken throughout the Mediterranean, particularly in trade, but also due to the fact that as part of the Kingdom of Aragon, the country had possession of Sardinia, Sicilia, and Athens, in addition to the Balearic Islands. A good portion of what's now Roussillon and the area of southern France. In 1701, King Louis XIV decided that to consolidate his reign, he didn't want local languages such as Català, Escursa, or Occitan spoken by regions, because he felt it destroyed the unity of the country, and he banned the use of all those regional languages in governance, in the schools, and also in religious usage. Later, King Philip V of Spain made a similar edict, which affected Catalonia itself, the remaining Catalonia, what we call Catalonia today, and banned the use of all regional languages in what was the Iberian Peninsula at the time. These were the politics which began to drive 275 years of repression of the language Català. Next slide, please. I had a extensive dialogue with Mr. Arbre Agulo Higuera, who was born in 1949 in the city of, or the town of Alcoy, which was part of the community of Valencia. And I asked him a series of questions, which I will relate to you now. Question, Senor Agulo, your parents were born before the Civil War. How did they learn to speak Catalan? My parents were from the town of Alcoy in the community of Valencia. They spoke Valencia Catalan. They lived through the Guerra Civil. My father was a medical officer in the Republican Army. When General Franco's fascist nationalist army succeeded in overthrowing the Spanish Republic, my father was forced to serve in the fascist army units that were sent alongside the Nazis on the Russian front during World War II from 1939 until 1942. The community of Valencia had spoken Valencia Catalan for many generations, but the new powers wanted to eliminate the language, and they passed laws prohibiting the teaching of Catalan. They continuously insulted and denigrated it by saying speaking Valencia Catalan is for farmers or maceros. Next page. Question, what was the impact of the prohibition of teaching and learning of Catalan? Answer, the Franco regime succeeded in eliminating the public use of Catalan in the cities of Valencia and Alicante, but it continued in the villages and in the countryside. From 1939, all schools taught in Castellà. I could not learn Catalan in my school, but our family used it in our home. Many of our names were changed because they were not Castilian enough. During the Franco regime, mostly in Catalonia, intellectuals, writers, cultural and folkloric associations met in private to keep the language alive through various publications. And in 1961, through the creation of the Entidad Omnium Cultural to oppose the persecution of Catalonian language and culture. They organized neighborhood groups to teach Catalan in the homes. Question, after Franco died in 1975, a constitutional monarchy was established in España. In 1979, Catalonia became an autonomous state and Catalan was declared the official language. How was the transformation to using Catalan in the schools accomplished? Senor Agulo, when the democracy returned, most of the school teachers had no knowledge of Catalan. After the elections, new institutions were created and neighborhoods organized. Cultural associations all worked with collective effort to train teachers to teach Catalan. It was then, as an adult, that I could learn grammar, handwriting, and linguistic rules. The Parlement de Catalunya passed measures for universities to train teachers, and all of us were educated in Catalan through an immersion method, which continues to produce very good results today. Unfortunately, the Spanish judiciary has recently decided to oppose immersion approach in our schools. In addition, El Catalan is suffering from the trend of young people who use English or Castellà in their social circles. It is time for the academic community, cultural associations, and civil society to join together in a campaign to again defend the use of Catalan. Next. Ara y sempre l'escola en Català. Now and forever, Catalan in schools. Moltes gracias. Thank you. Now we will hear from an advocate for foreign language learning in America, in the United States particularly, Dr. Kathleen Stein-Smith, who is a well-known author and authority on the use of languages and the importance of foreign language learning to our national security, to our international competitiveness, and to our preservation of culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'd like to first say good morning to everybody. Bonjour, buenos dias, guten tag, buongiorno, hello from New York. I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this event for having invited me to participate, and especially Mark Harris. Mark Harris, through his program, Many Languages, One World, and through all that he does, really has had a profound impact on my professional life and my work as a language educator and advocate. So thank you all, and thank you especially Mark Harris. One of my favorite quotes about language learning is from Nelson Mandela. And paraphrasing, if you talk to a man in a language that he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart. And that is truly, truly so important. Now, going to the next slide, we're talking about the US foreign language deficit, the importance of multilingualism in a globalized and interconnected world, how to effectively address that deficit through advocacy, through really a broad-based coalition of educators and language stakeholders, and especially parents and communities. And also multilingualism for a better world, many languages, one world, and they will be, the speakers following me. Wonderful young people, all of them, and it was a wonderful experience for me to have had the privilege of working with them. But there are underlying issues to this US foreign language deficit that we don't always talk about. And that really is the importance of heritage languages in the US. Most Americans, contemporary modern Americans, have another language in their life, in their family story. They may speak it, or they may be lost or forgotten. But there are also, on the other side, many people in the US who really have not perfected English. And so they are basically held back in the workplace. Children are held back in school. And that's the other side of the English speaker learning other languages, but also helping new Americans to perfect their English so that they can actually lead the lives that they want to and that they deserve. I work on a college campus. One of the things I hear all the time is, I want to help. I want to make the world a better place. I believe in the Sustainable Development Goals. And, to do that, it is certainly more than helpful to have another language. And key in the US, and these issues may pertain elsewhere to varying degrees, is that a question of affordability and accessibility. And I think online learning, distance learning, is going to be a great way to, quote unquote, level the playing field, to give everybody that equal access and equal opportunity. So I love this idea of mother tongue plus two. My mother tongue is English, and my primary languages are French and Spanish, and I've had the opportunity to study Italian, German, and of course Latin. But anyway, moving on to the next slide. Mother languages are spoken by 70 million at home. Only 1 in 5 students can get access to a language in our schools. And that's actually true. Fewer than 20% of US students study another language. And why? Often it's because they're not offered. Basically 15% of US elementary schools where young children attend, young children of all levels of affluence can attend, they offer 15% of them offer a program in another language. And that number is dropping, it's declining. So this question of access and affordability, getting languages where our children are and getting them there in an affordable environment, these are critical, critical issues. Next slide, please. The importance of multilingualism in a globalized and interconnected world. Okay, multilingualism is so basic to the work of the UN. We're here today. The Office of Multilingualism at the UN is very central to getting the word out, getting information to people around the world, getting people also to work together. Now, on the next slide, just a quote from a great article Do you speak my language? You should. And this raises the point that the future, it's not just the future that's multilingualism, it is the present. And I think that's critical in the US to getting buy-in from parents, community leaders, decision makers in our schools about the importance of languages. There's a parent is generally the person who wants the best for their child. And I think buy-in for parents that languages are important now. Next slide, please. And there have been calls to action. AMACAD, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of course, issued the famous report, America's Languages, in 2017, following up in December of 2020 with a very brief report, but very profound. And what was unique about this report, it was the national academies of 5 nations. And interestingly, the 5 Anglophone nations. And we are collectively the weakest in terms of acquiring other languages for a variety of reasons. But they call for a renewed commitment to multilingualism in our society and within education, okay? And they say it is critical to preparing present and future generations of citizens who will be responsible for building international collaborations and fostering harmony at home. That's another issue. In our communities, there is a multitude of languages routinely spoken. I'm in the New York area. I can't go anywhere that I don't hear lots of languages. I personally enjoy it. There was a study recently that said that there are 800 languages spoken in New York City alone. That's amazing. Next slide, please. Now, how do we do this? Educators, parents, everybody working toward this goal of multilingualism. But actually, there are 2 areas that are primary. And one is really our government policy. And next slide, please. At the national level, in addition to educators, we have the organization JNCL, the Joint National Committee for Languages. Okay? They spearhead a language advocacy day once a year, where language stakeholders actually talk to our government officials, try to get them involved, get them interested. Next slide, please. Our advocacy day just happened in February of this year. And so we've got those JNCL language advocacy days. We also have in the American Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, a languages caucus interested in promoting languages and language learning, language use and language learning. So that's in the legislature, the federal legislature of the US. And also, there are many groups out there, but right here in New York and in Paris, there is a group called CALEC, the Center for the Advancement of Languages Education and Communities. That's important. It's not just about the language and the language learning. It's about the communities of people who speak these languages. Next slide, please. Now, 2 seminal works, absolute must-reads for people who are interested in promoting multilingualism. In this first book, The Bilingual Revolution, talks about heritage languages and dual language immersion. Dual language education is a universal good. Now, this author, Fabrice Chaumont, is based in New York, I believe, and he provides in this book a roadmap for parents who want to start a dual language immersion program. This is truly grassroots advocacy. How do interested parents who want either their children to learn a language or that want to preserve their family language, what do they do? What are the steps that they take? How can a parent change the system? Okay, must read. All right, for those of you, especially US based, but actually has applications in many, many areas on how to bring about change, how to be that change agent for your child, for your community. Next slide, please. Another great book published this past year, 2021, is America's Bilingual Century. Okay, and a critical question is, where will your language live in your life? as Americans who may be accustomed to speaking only English, how are we going to make room for that other language so that we can either learn a new language, learn a forgotten heritage language, or learn a language that we are interested in? Okay, and this author, Steve Levine, approaches this from a sociological perspective, but it is an inspirational book. Again, of interest to all and written in language like the book that precedes this, The Bilingual Revolution, interested in accessible to all. We can all pick up these books and read them. But anyway, Levine's message is that we can and should return to our multilingual roots. We have had an overwhelmingly English language narrative of our cultural identity and of our history in the US. And actually, if you look at history and you look at the people and you look at the places in what is now the US, we have always been bilingual, and we may just historically have briefly forgotten that. Next slide, please. Anyway, many languages for a better world. These will be our next speakers. And a more inspirational program and a more inspirational group of young people and dedicated professionals working with them, I have yet to meet. It was an impactful experience, I know, for me, just as a facilitator, and it has to have been transformative, globally transformative for the participants. Next slide, please. Here, I couldn't resist a picture of these really darling young people. This was the 2017 group, and at the UN, they all actually got to speak in their adopted language, the language of their essay, on the issues that were deeply related to their hearts, and on their action plans, not just talk, action plans. Please stay in touch.
Thank you, Dr. Klein-Smith. Thank you very much, Dr. Stein-Smith. Now we're going to hear from some of these Many Languages, One World essay winners. Next slide, please. The essay contest, actually, Ramu Damodaran, who is with us today, approached me on behalf of the United Nations Academic Impact and the United Nations itself as the president of Berlitz and ELS at the time, to create some kind of event which would involve university students around the world and would challenge them to express the relevance and the importance of multilingualism to global citizenship. After some consideration, I proposed the idea of an international essay contest, because the international essay contest would not only impact the people who won the contest, but it would also profoundly affect the way of thinking about languages and global citizenship of all the contestants and all the people who would witness the presentations. And I said to Ramu, if we could get permission from the UN that these students would each individually stand at the front of the General Assembly during a live and fully interpreted event at the UN, their sense of commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN as an institution would be firm forever, and that these people would become active and vocal advocates for the UN. Next slide, please. And these are just some numbers for you to look at. The number of authenticated and fully explored essays over a 4-year period, once each year for 4 years, were more than 8,700 essays, which must have been languages which had neither been the mother language nor the language of instruction in their primary and secondary education. So these are acquired languages, and usually many of them were third or fourth languages for the contestants. We had essays from 170 countries, and we had more than 2,000 universities participate in the authentication of the essays. And we have today 3 of the winners of this essay contest, who statistically were an average of 3 out of every 100 essays were selected and brought to New York to participate in the Youth Forum. And that's 3%, which is much more selective, even the Harvard University and the most respected and desired universities in the world. So they're an elite group, they're multilingual. Next slide, please. This is a picture which is similar to the one just shown by Dr. Stein-Smith. So we'll go on to the next slide and see it up close. This was just the English essay winners in the 2016 competition. And let us move forward and hear from 3 brilliant young talents who are multilingual, and they will tell you why and how they acquired their languages and what it has changed in their lives and facilitated in terms of advocacy. So we will begin with Ms. Sara Jeffar.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The extended version. Hello, sabahul khair, masa'ul khair, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending from where you're joining us. I'm Sara Jeffar. I'm from Morocco. My academic title is Doctor in Literature. But my research field ranges from women's rights, gender equality, and currently I am pursuing another degree in political science in Italy. So I'm also learning Italian. First of all, before starting my presentation, I would just like to thank so much Mr. Mark Harris, that I like to call the spiritual father of all the MLOers, of all the MLO people, the young people who know him. Thank you so much for the support, for your help, your continuous support, your help. Thank you for including us in this kind of important discussions like today's. I would also like to thank the organizing committee for thinking about this webinar and for the organizing efforts. And I cannot go on in my presentation without acknowledging the important presence of Mr. Ramu Damodaran, who was my supervisor during my internship at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. So it's a real pleasure to be amongst all these special people, very dear to my heart, that I learned a lot from. And so if we go to the next slide, Peter, please, thank you. So I was asked to speak about my linguistic journey, but I just wanted to put that question out there. Is there a choice to be or not to be multilingual? I just want us to reflect on this. It was one of the questions that I remember I discussed with Mr. Harris, and I was thinking, do our governments actually implement strategies and do enough for us to have languages included in our educational programs and so many other things. So I just want us to reflect on this question. Probably we'll get to discuss that in the Q&A session. But I think I will now speak about my linguistic journey. I think my journey was a very joyful, very light one, very rich one. I think what I can remember is that I learned French in the French school that I went to as a little girl. And I remember that I never had a problematic relationship with the language, because when I grew up in Morocco, of course, we have the history with France, and we were colonized with France for a certain amount of time. And I know that the generations before me, some parents, for example, chose not to send their kids to the French schools because they wanted to keep that exclusivity, for example, to Arabic. But I think I am lucky enough that my parents realized at a young age that learning languages could never harm, and it is, of course, a positive thing to do. And so I just here also reflected on that the point that history and the collective memory of our society creates the awareness of any identity, of any language's identity. And so we develop that identity with the language. And I think I chose, and many other people of my generation chose, to make the best out of that experience, to learn the language for what it is and for what it can give us. I also remember that I evolved as I was young with that love for multilingualism. Arabic was the first love, the language of my soul, of my heart. Then French came, and I was just in love with the library and how colorful it is. And in the French Institute I used to go to, we have a French Institute in Kenitra that we call Balzac. And then English came, and now I started learning Japanese, German. Now I'm learning Italian, also Turkish, because I love to sing, and now I'm singing Turkish songs. And so I think during my life, I had these many linguistical love stories, and that are just participating in creating who I am. And I think multilingualism is just so important was important in my life. Since I'm speaking about things from my perspective, I gained a lot of maturity in analyzing the linguistical and social components that a language brought in my life when it comes to building the confident, I could say, researcher in academia and professional that I am today. And so I believe that it is a very humbling, humanizing, and eye-opening experience. Next slide, please. Yes, and I had also in my life experiences like the Erasmus one, MLOW, and the UN one. Erasmus, if I had to say or to comment on that wonderful experience that I had, I got to do my research, my PhD academic research in the University of Padova in Italy. And that was my first contact with young people from all over the world. That's when I realized that I actually belong to a global community. I'm Moroccan, but there are so many other people from all around the world who actually study and do research. And that was my first contact with realizing that there is a global community out there, because it's something to hear about it, and it's something when you experience it. And then the MLOW came, the Many Languages One Word experience. And then the United Nations internship came. And I think if I had to define it, I would say that those defined the epitome of what I call global citizenship. The ability to be able to stand in the General Assembly Hall, to be given the mic, and to be listened to. You are given a voice, and everybody's listening to you. But something else that I realized is that global citizenship is also to be aware of the bond that we have together as young people. There's a bond that ties us to each other, no matter where you're from. It's almost magical, I can tell you that, because I was there at the GEA, and I was during the workshops of the MLO, and I did an internship in a wonderful UNAI team. And so I know what that means. And there is such power in that feeling, because you realize that whatever dreams you have, we want justice, we want our rights, and we want so many things. But when we realize we are not the only one that wants that, but a lot of other people, there's actually an us behind that. So there's an empowerment, and therefore we have more confidence, and we're sure that we're going to reach that. And I remember at my time at the UN, I volunteered, I worked during the organizing of the International Women's Day, and I was holding the sign for the SDG 5. And those are not just words, those are not just empty promises, or the 2030 agenda is not there just like that. It actually is possible to accomplish that. And if we only remember, and I do remember one of the important TEDx talk that I listened to, during the MDGs, we actually exceeded one of the targets in reducing poverty. We went far beyond, we did even better than the targets. So it is possible if we work all together. First of all, if we realize that we are all together. Next slide, please. And yes, I realized that there's actually a lot of power that lies in the cycle of multilingualism, because if we take an individual who chooses to go out of his comfort zone and chooses to learn a new language, that is a challenge in itself. Not anyone would do that. That shows a lot of commitment and a lot of confidence. And automatically, when we spot those two things, we definitely have a change maker. Next slide. Thank you. And then I actually realized during also the chance I got to translate one of Mr. Harris's articles when he spoke about his journey to learning Spanish, and he spoke about the fourth dimension. I realized that there is actually a seventh sense of awareness that we have when we are multilingual. When you decide to learn a new language, when you exist in another language, you exist under a different light. And so that participates in building our identities, in healing traumas and souls, in nurturing our emotional intelligence so much, in understanding the other. And we need this today. The immigrant, the refugee, the stranger in the street, the loved one even, to understand ourselves, to support scientific research, to facilitate peace, development, justice, diplomacy, and international relations. Learning a new language is like looking at ourselves in the mirror, but each time we can choose to stand under a different light. We have the blue, the red, the green, the yellow, and we discover ourselves differently. I think there's another slide after this one before the... Absolutely, because multilingualism indicates a high sense of respect, empathy. It indicates that we have the roots of solidarity in our hearts, compassion, the will to form sustainable ties on many levels. It opens our minds and souls to another type of consideration, a new kind of codified vision, a fresh layer of understanding. And that's what I called a seventh sense of sensibility. It's like having a lot of keys, and we just have to reach out because it will open a lot of doors, and it will definitely be the best experience you could have. And so it is that secret key to a new dimension of understanding, as I said. I hope we will all take advantage of the keys we have, and without taking much more time, shukran jazilan for your attention. Merci beaucoup. Grazie mille. Arigato. Teşekkürler.
Hi everyone, Magadi Linjani, 大家好. My name is Gugulethu. First things first, I'd like to thank Mr. Mark Harris and everyone who organized this webinar and the CTAUN for their efforts in trying to make sure that everyone is aware about the positive effects of being multilingual and how that affects our society. To introduce myself, I'm from Zimbabwe and I speak Shona and Ndebele, which are languages from here. And then the languages that I've learned are Chinese, Mandarin, and Russian. And then as for English, it's a language that we've been taught in school. It's the language of instruction here in Zimbabwe for most schools. I did my chemical engineering degree at Jiangsu University in China. And I was one of the winners for the Many Languages One World competition in 2017. The Chinese group. I'm currently a data analyst at a company called Data Pro, and I think that's it for my introduction. Next slide, please. So my slides are very brief, but I will have a lot to say. So to start talking about my language learning journey, I started in 2014. I moved to China. My reason to moving to China was very simple at the time. I was looking for an affordable option for studying, and also my brother and my sister already there, so it was a clear choice. The first thing I can tell you that I learned when I was learning Chinese was that, like any other subjects that you will learn when learning a language, if you put in the time, the interest and the effort, you will get results. Because for me, when I first went to China, in my head, I had this image of Chinese as this impossibly difficult language to learn. It is so hard. How am I going to be able to learn it? And I was even behind when I joined my class. I was behind by a few weeks, and I was thinking, oh, this is hopeless. But the same way that you put in effort to catch up in any class, in a math class or an English class, I got results, and the results were beyond a grade or ranking in class. I realized that in this new environment that was so foreign to me, I was no longer someone who's just watching this foreign environment, someone who's just experiencing it. I was beginning to participate in the environment. I could ask for help from a stranger in the street. I could navigate the city more by myself. Of course, it's not an overnight experience, but it was a very eye-opening experience for me. And I managed to form relationships with people, and I learned so much about a culture that is so deep and intricate. And I expanded my mind beyond what I understand and what I know. And instead of looking at other cultures or other languages in a cynical light because I do not understand them, I realized that I need to approach it with respect, because there's so much we don't know. And even if we do not understand it, we'll rather, approach it with respect. And so after learning Chinese for 1 year at Shanghai International Studies University, I decided I wanted a change in environment again. So I moved to Russia, and there I learned Russian language in St. Petersburg for 1 year. And the first thing that I noticed was how different, of course, the languages are. And, having learned both languages back to back, I tried to compare the two languages, which one is easier, which one is harder. But the main thing that I realized was how unique each language is and how deeply rooted it is in the culture that it represents. And how much when you learn a language, when you learn a culture, you are able to appreciate the environment you're in more. You're able to form an opinion about where you are, about the people you're meeting by yourself through experiences, and you are more informed. You are able to respect others again, even better. And after I learned Russian, I moved back to China to do my degree. And again, I started learning Chinese again because it is a language that you need to keep, going through and learning. And when I was in my first year, my Chinese teacher told me about Many Languages, One World. And at first, I wasn't sure if I could do it. I just said, okay, then I participated, and luckily I won. And when I went to the US and the experience of going to the United Nations and speaking on such an incredible platform, it was completely life-changing for me. And one of the other great things was meeting so many like-minded people whose views and understandings of the world were so deep and interesting, people who spoke so many languages. It was incredible. And people who pursue education and global citizenship in such an inspiring way. And afterwards, it even inspired me to go back to school and to try and teach and invite everyone else around me, the other students around me, to learn more about the SDGs and to participate more in their society and to make an impact. And I think the main thing was the experience of MLOW empowered me, because it showed me that I had an impact on my environment. The individual that I am, the one person that I am, I'm able to make an impact in the world. And after that, there were so many other positives that I experienced. I managed to write an article for the UN Chronicle, and when people read it, their reactions were also again empowering to me, because I realized that my opinion mattered, my experiences mattered. And so that was a very empowering situation for me. And having learned those two languages, it opened up an entire world for me, because I realized that as people, we tend to prioritize the things we understand the most, and that is our own cultures, our own languages. For other cultures and languages, we know what we know from, literature or from TV or from media. We know about the holidays, we know about the images, we know about the clothes, but we tend to minimize it to that. And for me, learning the languages and experiencing the cultures taught me that there is way more than we see. It seems obvious, but it takes experiencing to understand. So I think that if we all took an initiative to learn about each other, to learn about each other's languages, to learn about each other's cultures, we would have a more richer experience when we're trying to have conversations, when we're trying to build relationships, when we're trying to build our world together. Next slide, please. So yeah, those 4 points for me would sum it all up. Of course, there's more to say, but I think those 4 points sum it up perfectly. Yes, of course, learning languages, in my experience, gives more access to opportunities. For example, right now, after I graduated, I did chemical engineering, but in this job climate with the virus and everything that's happening, it was difficult to find a job in my major, but I managed to find a job that required the use of my Chinese language skills. And I was very grateful for that. And so, the more languages you know, the more experience you have with other languages and cultures, it's actually very helpful in a material way. There's also exposure to unique and incredible opportunities like Many Languages, One World. There are opportunities like going to New York, to places you've never been to, or speaking at the United Nations, but also there's the experience and the access to such incredible communities that will help you grow in so many ways. And you gain mentors and friends and people who are inspirations and help you to move up to the next level. Like I said before, learning another language gives you the ability to hold more effective cultural dialogue, not only on your end, but the people around you, when they see you make an effort to learn about their language, to learn about their culture, I think that they open up more to you because they see a friend in you, someone who is trying to move towards them in a positive manner. And of course, like I said before, gaining a deeper respect of other cultures and languages is something that would definitely happen as you learn languages, because whether it's the difficult parts or the easy parts or the exciting parts, you will definitely get to understand the people around you more and the environment and the language you're learning. So that is my experience with learning languages. I think that I have so many people to thank who guided me on that experience, who encouraged me in that experience. And of course, Mr. Mark Harris is one of them, my teachers and a lot of people. So I'm very grateful for that experience, and I hope that more people will take the steps to get out of their comfort zones and to try and learn something about each other and each other's languages and each other's cultures. I'm very grateful to the CTAUN for making the efforts to spread the awareness about languages in the UN. Thank you again for inviting me to speak and participate in this incredible webinar. I have already been learning so much from the previous speakers, and I'm definitely going to be learning more as the next speaker shares. So thank you so much. I'm forever grateful. Thank you.
Hi everyone, buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. First, thank you, Mark, for inviting me. It's a big pleasure to be here and to take part in this webinar and to have this chance to talk about the importance of multilingualism in my experience. Okay, a little bit about me. I'm Elisa, I'm 31. I was born and I live in Rome. And concerning my studies, I graduated first in performing arts and then in screenplay writing. For a while, I worked in TV production companies and in the technology education. I know they are very different fields, but they brought me where I'm now to get my current job. Today, I'm part of the communication and advocacy project team at the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development, in short called ASVIS. ASVIS is the most important Italian no-profit network that works for the fulfillment of the UN 2030 agenda. And it brings together more than 300 member organizations among the civil society. ASVIS is involved in many activities. For instance, organized the Sustainable Development Festival that represents one of the most important events to raise awareness about SDGs and the 2030 agenda in Italy and abroad. Okay, but I'm here today to talk about the importance of multilingualism in my experience. So next slide, please. I would like to do it, to talk about the multilingualism in my life, taking inspiration. I would like to take inspiration. I don't know if you know this book, but from The Hero's Journey. The Hero's Journey is a famous narrative pattern written by the writer Joseph Campbell. Campbell divides the hero's journey into three main acts. The first act is the call to adventure or departure. The second step is the initiation. And in the hero's journey, Campbell, the last step is the return. But in my slide, I add one step, transformation. So I really hope Campbell will forgive me for this. But next slide. Okay, so the first question is to address is why and how did I learn languages? So I started to study English in middle school and then French in high school. But I have to say that in both cases, I didn't have very inspiring teachers. I could say the opposite. And then when I was at school, languages was something, for me, was something very, very distant. I mean, languages were fascinating me, but I used to consider not relevant, I have to say. But everything changed when at university I decided to take part on the Erasmus program. And so my first step, my first act, the call to adventures, started in Montpellier in the south of France, in a really lovely place close to the sea. And suddenly studied English and studied French became useful. I mean, I started to speak with people, and language became really like a passepartout to communicate with new people. So my Erasmus was really a powerful experience and changed my way of looking at life, and mostly changed my interests. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the second question is, how did languages change my way of thinking about the world and my responsibilities? Okay, I could say that after my Erasmus program, I realized that I had a responsibility as a European citizen and global citizen to help the intercultural dialogue. So I tried to understand what was happening in Europe and in the world, economically and politically speaking. And one day, totally by chance, I came across the international essay contest, Many Language, One Word, on my university webpage. So totally by chance. And here begins the second step of my hero's journey, the initiation. I mean, my Erasmus program taught me the importance of languages, but I wanted to understand how to commit myself in what direction to go. During my Language One Word Week in New York City, the answer came to me from the 2030 agenda. I strongly believe that the Agenda 2030 is an incredible plan for people, for planet, and for prosperity. And it doesn't matter age, sex, location. Every person can try to achieve even a small piece of the agenda according what they mostly care about. So I think it's really, really powerful. And I really want to say that because I learned about the SDGs in many language one word contests, in my head, languages and SDGs are deeply linked together. Okay, next step, next slide, yes. So the third question is, how do these languages empower me to support the SDGs? So learning languages gave me the opportunity to open a dialogue with people who are working to promote the 2030 agenda. And thanks to languages, thanks to multilingualism, I did an internship at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, France, in the internal communications department. And at the Council of Europe, for the first time, I learned more about the Sustainable Development Goals. And they stand to understand that they really want to work for the 2030 agenda, like full time. About this, I would like to quote Mark, when during the Peace Day 2021, he said, "I always believed that language is the key toward peace. And I'm also convinced that multilingualism has a lot to do with build a world of peace. If we can speak if we can't speak the language of the person in front of us, we can also better understand her reason, I think. So that's why I think it's really, really important to invest in education and especially in language exchange program. And the last question, the next slide, okay, is how did the learning process itself change the way you think? Okay, so I can say that learning languages has totally changed my perspective. When you learn a language, I think you have to be a bit handy. The American writer Amy Chua, I don't know if you know, says, "Do you know what a foreign accent is? Is a sign of bravery." And I agree with this sentence, because when you live abroad, especially at the beginning, anything can happen. You change city, house, bank account, phone number, all at the same time, and all in another language. So I think you have to be a bit brave. As I said in my previous step, I wanted to work for on the 2030 agenda, and if possible, I wanted to do it in my city, in Rome. So while I was working in other fields, screenplay and technology education, I created a website with short stories related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And step by step, I arrived at my current job at the Italian Alliance for the Sustainable Development Goals. And here we go the last step of the hero's journey, the return. What you see here in the picture, in my slide, is a famous monument in Rome, a pyramid, the Piramide Cestia, built in the first century before Christ. And last year, during the Festival of Sustainable Development, we had this monument lit up with the symbol of the 2030 agenda. And we celebrated the end of the festival just right there. So for this reason, I decided to take this picture. And today at ASBIS, in the communication and advocacy project team, I have the opportunity to work every day for the promotion of the 2030 agenda in a national and international context. And I will say that this would not have been possible without my multilingualism journey. And in conclusion, I like thinking that languages are not just like complex grammatical structures or mechanisms, but they are like, in my opinion, human relationships. We need to take care of them for them to work. And the multilingualism has definitely changed my life, my point of view. And I like to say that multilingualism guides me in my everyday journey. So thank you for your attention. Grazie.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having joined this rich conversation. I'm Ramu Damodaran, who was extraordinarily privileged to have been part of an early discussion with Mark Harris, which led to the Many Languages, One World, which he led, and I would say founded more than co-founded. And it's wonderful to see so many old friends here. I see Irfan Ahmed and Mohammad Ali Afsan from my own country, India. And of course, Luisa Soto, who was one of the main inspirations behind the contest every year. We really had a full and rich discussion, gone beyond the time that we had suggested. So I'd really like to conclude with about 10 minutes, if I may, of a conversation with all of you, bringing in some of the points that have been raised in the discussion. And I'd like to begin by posing a question which has really been put by several people, and I'd like to put this to Aleksey, including a member of CTAUN, Diane Parvazian, who spoke about the languages and culture, in a sense, empowering each other. And Aleksey, you spoke about craftsmanship or indigenous crafts as a vehicle for communicating the richness of language. And there was also just recently in chat a question from Nancy Brown, who asked about the power of the arts in furthering multilingualism and language education. Could you share your perspective of that, Aleksey? Arts, crafts, and human creativity as a vehicle to communicate and learn languages.
Yes, thank you very much for these interesting questions. And I actually didn't mention, but I really wanted to during my presentation about the creativity, the creative economy, and its role in preservation and promotion of indigenous languages. This is a very timely and important discussion. You probably know that last year, the 2021 was designated by the UN as the International Year of Creative Economy for Sustainable Development. And during that year, we discussed a lot how multilingualism and indigenous languages on the internet and indigenous languages in general through their traditional knowledge could contribute to the local economies and creative economies, including crafts, design, literatures, music, theater, and many, many other spheres that belong to the so-called the economy of the knowledge, creative economy. So indigenous peoples have a lot to say through the languages in terms of the creativity and local economies. And even like in Russian Federation, for example, even very rich areas that are rich with the oil and gas, like the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug Yubra, for example, would like to diversify the economy and invest in the people, invest in the local knowledge, in the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, and therefore invest in the indigenous languages. So that region that I just mentioned has, among first in Russia, adopted a regional law on support of creative economy and indigenous languages. So this is a very important step that I think other regions and maybe even beyond Russia could consider as a possibility during the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So I very much support this idea and would like to mention one more time that even in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we speak a lot about the need for the languages not to be a burden on on the society or a budget, national budget or regional budget. It should be considered, indigenous languages should be considered as a vehicle for or a factor of sustainable development, of a factor of security, factor of economic well-being. So I strongly believe that the International Decade of Indigenous Languages can contribute to this shift of paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Alex. And really, by bringing the elements of security and development, you've also tied the study of languages to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are so enriched by the creative economy to which you made reference. I'd like to bring in another very cherished friend of the Many Languages, One World event, Dr. Kathleen Stein-Smith. And she began with a very powerful quote from Nelson Mandela about the idea of reaching the heart rather than the head. And that brings me to a question from Anam Bibi, who asked about the role of technology in acquiring languages. And this also brought to mind something which another valued member of CTAUN, Dr. Ruth Nielsen, had spoken about when she's teaching English as a second language. It's often to people who find it difficult to write and communicate in their first language. So you're really talking to people who the empowerment that language brings an empowerment not just of the head, but of the heart, to go back to the Mandela phrase. So, Kathleen, how would you, from your long experience, see how the communication and teaching of languages has been transformed by technology?
You know, that is really a very perceptive question. Thank you so much. You know, right now, I have been very interested by the role of online learning, you know, and I'm interested in its role in terms of accessibility and affordability. And they're tied together. Accessibility. What about availability of language learning? If you live in a remote area, if you cannot afford tuition, if you cannot afford to travel to a distant place to learn the language that you choose. And what about accessibility? What about these schools? 85% of US elementary schools do not have a language program. Only 15% do. So how do we make this available? And right now, the most effective answer is really online distance learning. Can be asynchronous or synchronous, but it's how we can really reach people who, for a variety of reasons, even adult learners, non-traditional learners who are working, cannot travel, take time to travel to a school or college to learn a language. People who are learning English in the US in order to realize their full potential in the workplace need more English. They cannot take the time to travel. People have family responsibilities. People who may be wheelchair bound or mobility impaired. And so I think online learning, and that can be traditional classes, it can be an after-school program, a weekend program, a community-based program, not just a traditional language class. But of course, colleges, universities, and school systems are very well positioned to deliver this type of learning. So I think technology is there, you know, and we should use it. We should use it to its full potential as it continues to develop, to empower people to learn the languages they need and want to learn.
Thank you for that, Kathleen, and thank you for really introducing, in a sense, a word that is so powerful, both as an activity and, if I may, as a metaphor, the idea of travel, how language really allows you to travel both in terms of your mind, but physically. And that really brought to mind a couple of the points made in our larger conversation today. For instance, Tahir Yusuf Curio spoke about a roadmap. How can language facilitate the UN roadmap to youth? You bring in travel. You had Evelyn Barese, who spoke about her travel to Turkey and living with a host family there, and in her phrase, leaving a part of her heart there. And we were also happy to have Ayse Akimbar, who is actually from Turkey and wrote in from Istanbul. One of our CTAUN members, Naima Qayyum, leads a global studies program. And the whole idea of global studies, again, is about the travel of the mind. So that brings me to a question I'd like to put to our MLOW alumni and old friend, Sara Jeffar. Sara, you spoke, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if you can sing for us in Turkish, we'd be very grateful, but not to worry if you don't want to do that. Just tell us, how has music, which at one level is something so personal, and on the other hand, something which is so shareable, how is that for you something that language has enriched?
Actually, that started way back in time. Singing has always been a hidden secret passion of mine. My audience is my mother, my family. She always wants me to sing. And since I was since I was in school, I remember that the first thing that why I actually started learning Japanese was because I used to enjoy watching a lot of, I remember there was this channel that was called Manga that had this animes about theater, and I really used to enjoy that. And that's how I started learning Japanese, because I started singing in Japanese. And I remember remembering by heart the lyrics, even though I didn't understand, but I remember by heart, and then I look for the meaning. That's how I started. And now it's happening again with Turkish. And even in the beginning of when my learning English, I actually started by listening to songs of Celine Dion when I was 13, and so many things. And lately it's happening with Turkish. I don't know when it's going to happen again with another language. I'm not sure I will be able to sing.
No, that's fair enough, because I saw also in the chat there have been many suggestions about having an MLOW reunion. And I'm sure if ever that does happen, both virtually and in terms of physically getting together, you will be persuaded to sing there. So I'm not going to press my luck in this
Yes, for
conversation.
sure, inshallah. Yes, I will sing.
And I see nods here and approval. So thank you very much. Let me move to Gugulethu Jemaine. You made a very powerful point about the learning of language being a sign of respect. And that brought to mind the fact that you have acquired Russian and Chinese, which are really, in a sense, global languages. They're official languages of the United Nations. But you also are obviously very well versed in Shona and in the Bele languages of Zimbabwe. How do you feel, and I'd like really a personal reaction from you, how do you feel when a foreigner comes to your country or to you and begins speaking in either of those languages, which obviously they have taken the trouble to learn, but which are still languages strange to them? What goes through your mind?
I think that, like I said, I'm very grateful because on this side, I'm on the receiving end of it. It means that they are acknowledging my language and my culture, and that this is the language you speak here, and they're going out of their way, even though they know that they can speak in English and most people would understand them, they're going out of their way to say, I'm learning your language, I want to relate to you more, I want to understand you more. It's more personal in that way, and I think it helps us to create better relationships. And I think I would want to speak to that person even more beyond whatever they wanted to speak to me about, whether it was about business or an impersonal question. You want to create a better understanding of that person, because to you, they've shown you that they are more interested in learning about you as a person, about your culture, not just to gain whatever they came to gain and to just go.
Thank you for that, because it's also echoing what I think Kathleen Highland wrote in the chat about when you go to someone and speak a language they can understand, they see a friend and not a stranger. Which brings us to the presentation which really concluded our conversation very powerfully by Elisa Capobiance. And the whole idea, and I wanted to ask her, because you really, if I may, Elisa, are speaking not only from a country, but a continent. And we've seen so much about the new Europe. Mark referred to the language policies in the European Union, both in terms of school and practice. Does language help you to identify yourself both as an Italian and a European, or does it, in a sense, have a demarcation between the two?
Thanks for your question. Yeah, I think that when I started to study languages, in my case, French and English, I really changed my feeling, my responsibility with the world, and really was suddenly I understood that I did something. I really need to do something for people, and my responsibility comes with my languages. Yes, it's really connect, and I can say that I start to feel myself European and global citizen. I can say first global citizen with many languages, one word, and then European with my internship at the Council of Europe. So I really, languages was really, really important to define my responsibility and my way of thinking of the world.
That was so beautifully put. And really, Elisa, I think what that brings to mind is the whole point with which we began our conversation today, the idea of motherhood, the Mother Language Day, and how, as a mother, you're not only intimately involved with the child that you conceive and bear, but the world to which you are bringing this child. And so, as a mother, you have an interest, a vested interest, if I may, in that world. And so too, language, whether it is the mother language or the larger continental language you mentioned, or the global languages which all of us have spoken about, give us a sense of both involvement and caring, which is frankly, if I may say so, what the United Nations is all about. So thank you for all the perspectives that each of you have shared. Thank you for our audience, and allow me to turn this back to Mark and Anne-Marie. Mark, perhaps you would begin in our closing thoughts.
Well, as I expected from the beginning, the other speakers would be much more interesting than I. And I really appreciate very much what Aleksey said. This is very important. By the end of this century, we may lose half of the languages. It's expected that somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 languages may disappear before the turn of the century. And this is due to the aging of the fluent people who speak those languages, and the fact that many of them aren't documented and they're not written languages. So this is an extremely important project to have the decade of the languages, because this may be our last opportunity to develop sustainable practices, many of which Aleksey illuminated for us today, which will result or can result in the sustaining of those languages. I thank very much Dr. Stein-Smith, because she has been advocating continuously throughout her career to remind the United States that, as lucky as they may feel that their current generation speaks English, which is a world language, that's a place to rendezvous, but it's not a place of origin. And we have our heritage languages, and on the other hand, creating the bond of trust is more evident in what was described by these three MLOW multilinguists, which is learning the language of another is the important thing in making trust and understanding the other. And we need to do more of that in the United States, lest we become truly monolingual when those 70 million people are no longer bilingual or trilingual and no longer supporting our diversity. And Ramu, thank you again for these pertinent questions, and more importantly, for having made the theory and ideas of MLOW realized as J. Michael Adams would have wished them to have been, and as Ban Ki-moon wanted them to be. Our collaboration and the work of all the others has made this a reality. So I am honored to be a part of this meeting today as a participant more than as an organizer. And I thank CTAUN for sponsoring this event. and I'm honored to be an advisor to that organization. So I will pass this back to Anne-Marie, who will certainly invite those who are on the call today to please consider their future participation in CTAUN and the efforts that are made to teach about the UN, because the UN needs that support. Anne-Marie?
Yes. I'd first like to announce that CTAUN's next webinar will be on Friday, April 22nd, Earth Day. And we'll be focusing that day on climate change and global heating, along with what we can do together to restore our broken planet. Details are being finalized, but I do want to say that we have some excellent major speakers already in place. We intend to get registration info and more detailed info out to you real soon. But also, the United Nations can bring the multilingual experiences to your classroom or home with the UN Virtual Tour. As multilingualism is a core value of the UN, besides the 6 official languages, Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish, virtual guided tours are currently being offered in Italian, Korean, German, Portuguese, Hebrew, and Japanese, and they address key issues. So do check these opportunities out at un.org/visit. And now thank you from me to our most informative speakers, our fantastic CTAUN members, and to all of you joining us here today. You will be receiving a survey about this webinar, so please send us your responses. Thank you again, and glad that you could all join us.